Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Reed, and today I'd like to talk about ransomware and what to do if a ransomware attack happens to your organization. Why am I qualified to talk about ransomware? Well, I'm a software professional and security professional with more than 25 years experience, and I've seen ransomware attack in many organizations, large and small. At Acronis, we run a cyber protection center, which is a 24/7 operations running out of 3 countries, Singapore, Switzerland, and US. And we are helping our customers worldwide to deal with ransomware attacks and other data security issues. Acronis runs Cyber Protection Operations Center 24/7 worldwide out of 3 locations, Singapore, Switzerland, and US, and we help our customers to deal with ransomware attacks in their organizations. We provide up-to-date protection, response, and threat investigations. We also assist with incident recovery, post-incident recovery activities, and hardening. Acronis is a leader in cyber protections. We are a Swiss-Singaporean company, dual headquarters in those 2 countries, and we believe in global local presence. We are operating in 36 data centers now, and one of them is in Indonesia. Acronis is a global leader in cyber protection. We are a Swiss-Singaporean company, and we believe in global local presence. We operate 38 data centers, and one of them is in Indonesia. We are 1,600 employees and currently have 34 offices. If you run your organization and you have compliance requirements to keep your data locally in your country, you can use our data center in Jakarta to keep your data in Indonesia. Before we talk about the ransomware response, let's discuss a little about global and local trends. What happened over the last year in cybersecurity? So in our Cyber Protection Operations Center, we noticed 5 trends that continue to grow in this industry. One of them is obviously ransomware itself, but also we see that the attacks on the remote workers continue to grow. And we also see that social engineering is one of the 2 key infection vectors. Talking about ransomware, in 3 quarters of 2021, we saw a 65% of growth, which is a very significant one, obviously. It is worldwide, but Indonesia is the country that is not immune to those attacks, unfortunately. So that's one of the example of the press about the recent cyber attacks in Indonesia, but also our data shows that Indonesia ranks 34th worldwide and also the 3rd country in Southeast Asia by the number of ransomware detections. So this problem exists. And sooner or later, your organization may get compromised. So when it happens, what are you gonna do? I think there are a few steps to do it. Number 1 is don't panic, contain the breach, back up your data, make a call, whether you want to pay or not, negotiate if you need to pay, if you're willing to pay, and finally, make the lessons learned and do the post-mortem. So number 1 thing is definitely don't panic. You need to understand that at this point, when you see a ransomware node, the worst has already happened. Attackers are often try to bend your reality by saying that they're going to leak your data. But in fact, both in legal and technical terms, your data has already been leaked because attackers already have this data and they have seen it. So the confidentiality of your data at this point is compromised. You don't need to consider the publishing of this data as a factor that would influence your reactions. Because as I said, the data is gone by now. Attackers have it. You also need to understand the scale of the compromise. In the attacks that we are seeing in the real life, we often see that attackers are actually not able to penetrate all the systems, for example. Sometimes they only penetrate, say, Windows systems, but then we see that Linux systems are still intact. Or sometimes we only see that they manage only to encrypt data available on file shares, which may suggest that the servers themselves are not actually compromised. Sometimes one network segment is attacked and other network segments are not attacked. So you really need to understand what is the scope and where you are in terms of attack. To better understand that, I usually advise customers to look at what is called a cyber attack lifecycle. How attackers penetrate networks and what they're going to do once they penetrated it. If we look at a typical attack scenario, it is multi-step. Initially, attackers obtain some low-level access, non-privileged access on one compromised machine. Initial compromise, as I mentioned, often happens via phishing. It also might happen via some kind of vulnerability, like VPNs were recently targeted, or RDP, that is many organizations are using to provide remote access. So once they have access to a compromised machine, they started internal recon. And then they go into this, what we call lateral movement cycle. So they try to escalate privileges locally, compromise credentials that are available on this machine, then perform the next reconnaissance with the admin privileges. Sometimes they try to perform additional code execution, fetch more malware on the machine, and then they do the next recon on another machine, trying to, again, compromise threads, get admin, and so on and so forth. And they do this multiple times until they found a machine where they can escalate privileges, and this machine also happened to have domain admin privileges when we're talking about Active Directory. Once they have domain admin privileges, this is the total domain dominance, and then they are using it to encrypt data on all machines in this Active Directory domain. Sometimes, though, they don't need those or may not achieve those, and then, as I mentioned, they would revert to only, for example, encrypting the file servers that are file shares that are available on the network. Once you understood the scope and the scale of the compromise, start containing the breach. There are a few steps here, and the most obvious one is to disconnect the affected systems from the network. Now, again, if you enter negotiation at this point, attackers will try to bend your reality, and they will tell you that under no circumstances you need to disconnect your machines from the network. And the reason for that is that they may claim that the ransomware may stop operating, or you will not be able to decrypt your files if you want. The fact is that if you look at the common ransomware threat, it is designed to work on laptops, which are machines that could be connected and disconnected by their users at any time, and also they could be shut down at any time without affecting ransomware. So ransomware has actually to take this into account, and it works totally fine on the computers that get connected and disconnected from the network. You need to understand that. You also may want to hibernate the affected system instead of just disconnecting that. It may help with incident response and with a few steps that I will mention later. Since you understand how many systems are affected, you need to also consider what systems are maybe not affected at this moment. And you need to ask yourself a question: why did it happen? Were they differently configured? Do you believe that hackers were not able to obtain credentials for those systems? They were not exploited? Or it's a coincidence? Or maybe they were left on purpose so that attackers would have some kind of backdoor with their installed remote access tool that will help them to watch you responding to the breach. It happens sometimes, and you need to take this into account. Once you think you contain the breach, you need to do a backup. And it's not an obvious question, why would I need to do a backup when my data is already encrypted? And the answer is that you actually may need this data to decrypt it, but also ransomware is a software. And so as any software, it has bugs. And since it has bugs, if you only have one encrypted copy when you're trying to decrypt it, and if the ransomware has a bug in it and then the decryption fails and the original copy is destroyed for some reason, you don't have another copy to try it again. So consider making a backup. Another reason why to do that is that sometimes you may get access to decryption keys later without paying for it. It may happen because authorities sometimes, or they do all the time, make raids and they confiscate attackers' servers containing keys. And so once this happens, they public keys, like it did happen with the Cassia attack recently. Also, sometimes, as I mentioned, ransomware is a software, so it has bugs. And sometimes vulnerability in the encryption process, encryption procedure could be found, which would allow you to decrypt data without providing the key at all, given that you still have the data. So make a backup. That's really, really important. One more thing to consider is that if you put your system in hibernation and you do the backup in the offline system, you may have access to the operating memory of a RAM of your computer. Or alternatively, if you're using Acronis software, you can do what we call the forensics backup, which will also save a copy parts of your RAM system, RAM memory to backup, and this may assist you with investigation. Why it is useful? One of the reasons why it may be useful, again, is that ransomware is a software and it has bugs. I'm repeating myself, but it is important. What is happening is that sometimes attackers don't forget to actually properly delete the keys from memory once they are done with the encryption. And so if you have a memory dump, at a later time, you may find a way to get those keys from the memory dump and then again, decrypt your files without paying the ransom. Could be very important to make a backup. Now, once you've done all that, you contain the breach, you have a copy of your data saved, you know how much is encrypted and it's not, you may actually consider whether you want to go in negotiations or not. And then to pay or not to pay is a common question, and it is a source of many controversies. The problem with the discussions about whether you want or not want to pay a ransom is that there are many opinions about that. Unfortunately, some people who have those opinions and express those opinions never had to deal with the ransomware attack themselves. And so their experience is purely theoretical. In my view, the decision whether you need to pay a ransom or not is not a security team call. It is a business decision. And at this point, security team may want to advise to decision makers about their options, about potential costs, but ultimately the decision to pay the ransom would be of someone probably from the business side of the company. What you need to do often would be to contact authorities, regulators, if you're working in a regulated industry, because this is a data breach, someone had seen your data. And also, I strongly suggest if you don't have experience in your organization with dealing with those kinds of attacks, call into a professional company that works and can provide assistance with the incident response. They also may help you with securing your infrastructure after the incident. So you enter the negotiations. Remember that you may think that all cards on the criminal side, but it's not the truth. First of all, they have a very vague idea of how much you can afford to pay. They are interested in getting your money, but because they don't understand the nature of your business, their margins, the cash flow, they usually don't really know how much you're willing to pay. Even if they look at public data that is easy to digest and not at the raw financials, they still may not understand how really, what is really the sum that you're willing to pay, ready to pay. As a result, they are often demanding very large sums that are impossible to pay. And they do understand that. And so with proper negotiation, you really can bring the amount of ransom down. You have some leverage on your side and back. You know how much, because you did your assessment, you know how much will it cost you to recover, so you know where's your break-even point. You also know that you've contained the breach, the affected systems are disconnected, and maybe some more systems are disconnected. So you can know what would be your worst case scenario. You have some leverage on your side. You know what systems are compromised, and you know how much will it cost for you to recover from scratch. You're also confident that you contain the breach, so your assessment is valid. If you are in a regulated industry, by this point, you should already inform the regulators and authorities about the breach occurred, so they don't have this leverage on extorting on publishing data. You also should know that the people you are negotiating with are often not the same people who hacked your network. And the reason why this is happening is this ransomware is often operates in this ransomware as a service manner, which means that there are people who actually develop ransomware. They also run in the extortion and leak side. And then there are different people who work as a kind of freelancers trying to hack into other people's network. And so those freelancers compromise your network. And then once they did, they obtain the dedicated build of ransomware specifically for your organization that was deployed and then encrypted your files. But then you are negotiating with those people who developed the ransomware and not with the people who attacked it. And so those people actually may not even know what exactly happened in your organization. They may not understand the structure of your network. They may not understand how many files are encrypted, and so on and so forth. Also, the dynamics of relationships between those freelancers and ransomware developers could be different. For example, sometimes the freelancers have to pay for the encryption build in advance. And so they are doing that in order to actually get this private build that would be deployed on your system. And they already invested money into that. And they're hoping then to get their money back. So they may be pressed on actually get a net positive sum, even if their margin would be minimal, but they get it faster. So we have some leverage here, and you need to be definitely aware of that, and you need to definitely understand more about how this ransomware as a service system works in order to be more successful with your negotiations, if you go for them. And anyway, once this is done, you need to do the postmortem. You need to understand why, what is the root cause? Why at all did it happen? And sometimes you may or may not afford to do a full investigation and get the minute by minute timeline of what attackers did, but maybe it's not necessary in every situation. And all you need to do is to understand how the initial compromise worked and then how they move laterally. Complete the remediation, the obvious stuff that I don't want to repeat because you will see it and hear it everywhere in any other presentations, like change your password, install patches, revision systems that you believe are compromised, you know it. But then you need to really start thinking in terms of the larger planning about systematically what can you do to harden your system. And if you look at that, you need to understand why some companies are failing. we look at the stats, trying to understand what is the real reason behind the success of those ransomware attacks. And we see that actually both well-resourced and small companies fell victim of ransomware. The majority of the cases you're hearing about, like a $10 million demands, are less than 1% of the total thing. The biggest, the typical attack would be a mom and dad shop, and then a typical ransom would be, I don't know, between 5 and 10,000 US dollars maybe. So it's a smaller companies, actually. The majority of them are smaller companies. But very well-resourced companies could be attacked as well. What we see is that there's definitely a gap between attackers and defenders' capability. And we also see that the most common ransomware initial infection record, malicious emails, and vulnerable exposed servers, especially weak passwords. Some attacks do happen through the software supply chains, like the famous Cassia incident, but it's not prevalent in fact. What can you do to understand and respond to properly build defenses against ransomware attack is again to apply the same kind of life cycle as attackers do when they penetrate your network. So as I said, attackers move laterally, try to exploit privileges, and then repeat this until they get a full dominance. So what you can do, you can actually do the same kind of interaction. You try to compromise your network. You find the gaps that allow attackers, the simulated attackers, to compromise your network. And then you eliminate the gaps. You develop the ways to monitor for exploitation of those vulnerabilities. And then you repeat. And then you repeat again and again. And with every iteration, your network is getting more and more secure. How can we help with that? Well, Acronis does provide security assessment service, and we can assist you earlier with this defensive life cycle by doing the penetration testing, but also by working with you on the remediation step and developing with you the detection procedures and defensive playbooks. If attack happened, we definitely can assist you with incident response services. Have in advance helping you develop incident response plan, but during the incident as well, we can help you to provide the faster incident response. Finally, we can help with the building and security awareness services, and that would help you to minimize human error. Other services that Acronis provide, as I mentioned, incident response, awareness, and security services. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin, for that interesting session. I have a couple of questions for you from the audience, and I'm going to read it out to you. When dealing with ransomware, how to secure the most critical business processes that depend on technology?
Sure. So when you consider the most critical ones, like the ones that the operation of them would be the most important for your company and the loss of operation would be the most damaging one, you need to consider how much money you want to invest into that. If you think in terms of this cost-benefit analysis and you know how much you may lose, then you will know how much you can actually spend to protect it. And when you know that, you start from basic things and then you go up to more complex things until the amount of money that you're ready to spend for protection exceeds or matches your expectations. So for every system, not only for critical ones, I would start with regular patching and proper configuration. In situations that we see in real life cases where companies were ransomware, we see that many of them happened because the systems were simply not patched often. And sometimes those patches are not even like very recent. Sometimes there is something that is a few months old, and attackers exploited that. Another one, that the systems were terribly misconfigured. Like it was not a simple miss in a configuration, but it was like really significant misconfiguration that made the system much less secure. So I would start with that in any case, and then go up from there. The next step would probably definitely be to improve your authentication. So if you can do multi-factor authentication, whether this is one-time passwords, any kind of second factor, you should go for that. It would be the second thing. If you're going above that and you still feel that the system is really, really critical, you may want to consider to implement air gap. Air gap is when those systems are disconnected from the internet completely, or disconnected from all other networks, and to operate that system, as typically happening in various ICT deployments, like when you have managing complicated technological processes, for example. You can go for that, but this is definitely way more expensive. I'd like to highlight that ransomware attackers are no wizards. They often exploiting like very few but very common vulnerabilities. And so if you patch your system and you have strong authentication and good passwords, and you don't have terrible misconfigurations, you usually will be fine.
The next question is, how can one ensure a fair level of resilience in the workforce cyber risk?
So I am holding in this common opinion that it is very hard to rely on the resilience of the workforce alone. You can try training people to avoid phishing scams, for example. But the problem is that, in my experience, when we do a typical phishing exercise in an average organization, the success rate would be between 15 and 20%. So on average, if you have a really good phishing email, between 15 and 20% of people would click it. And then another maybe like between 3 and 7% would even enter their password. Which means that on average, if an attacker sends between 10 and 15 emails, they actually will succeed. They will get one click with the probability of 99+%. So I don't think training people not to click or not to enter their password works. What you need to do instead is you need to be able to actively respond to those attacks, and you also need to train your workforce to report an attack when they are seeing it. Like when they see a phishing email, they need to report it to you. Not only not to click, but if you see it, they really need to make a security team aware of it. And then security team needs to step in and quickly remediate. Block IP addresses, maybe block URLs. If they cannot do that, configure the firewalls on hosts, or things like that. So really master your incident response. So it's not really an incident at this point, but master your operational response to vulnerabilities, and then you will be much better protected.
The next question is, what should a company do when they realized they have no option but to pay the ransom?
Well, if they have no option to pay the ransom, then they should pay the ransom. I definitely, I mean, it's not a recommendation. I'm not a lawyer. This is not a legal advice, right? I mentioned in my presentation that I think at the moment when ransomware attack happened and the incident response did not succeed, and it came to a question whether you really need to pay the ransom, like whether like you really discussing this option, it's no more a security team call. Because security team job was to eliminate this very possibility for ransom to happen. Which means that if the company is in the position that their only option is to pay the ransom, it's basically the failure of security team. I'm not saying that you need to punish those people, and I don't think personal responsibility in those matters works actually as a deterrent or as a way to improve the quality of work. It does not. But I think that at this point, this is really the decision of the company CEO or board of directors, depending on the company size, and other people who are making those kinds of business decisions. And if they have no choice, well, they have to pay. Understanding what the consequences are, and understanding that paying the ransom actually may not lead to recovery of your data. We've seen this. There are some public cases, and I'm aware of some non-public cases where paying the ransom did not actually have to recover the data. One reason why it's such a problem is because I mentioned it. Ransomware is software, and as any software has bugs. So what may happen is that your files will get damaged on the attempt to decrypt them. And this is why I really strongly recommend to make a backup after you've got ransomware. So that if you try to decrypt files and they're damaged, then you still have an ongoing. And then another thing is that sometimes the decryption process is so slow because attackers are actually not trying to optimize the decryption. They always are trying to optimize the encryption because they want this part of the attack be rapid. And they're not really interested in speedy recovery. So it may happen that you have the key, you paid for it, you have the decryption key, but then you realize that the decryption will take months maybe, or weeks at least, which has happened recently with one large company. So you also need to consider that. But again, if you have no choice, then, well, you have no choice.
Thank you, Kevin, for sharing with us best practices and recommends on dealing with ransomware, unique techniques to assess severity of the breaches and beyond. Thank you once again.
I think there was one more question that I've seen in the chat. And the question was, with the rise of the ransomware incidents, is it necessary for enterprise to start considering a cyber insurance? And my opinion here is that you actually need to strive for protecting your organization, and the insurance is your last resort if you tried but failed. And then it will help you to cover the cost of this failure. But you also need to think about that very commonly, cyber insurance actually does not cover the full cost of the ransomware attack. And the only thing they cover would be the cost of calling in a company that would assist with incident response and recovery. And so that is something that is going to be covered. You will not get your data back. So you may go for that, but you also need to understand what you're getting from it. And I don't think cyber insurance is a substitute for securing your systems. Also, it gets very expensive, actually, if you're not securing your system, because the premium, given that the recent rise in the ransomware incidents, the premiums are also growing. And I see that, like, in some situations, they may grow up to 100% right now. And I think there is also one last question. It's very practical on how many times a recommendation is to run a backup. I think the question is how frequently you want to run the backup. And it totally depends on how much data you can afford to lose. So if you think that you can only afford to lose 1 day of your data, of your work, then by all means do the backup every day. If you think that you cannot afford to lose more than 4 hours of your data and it's going to have terrible consequences, then do it more often. And if you think that for some kind of data it's okay to lose 1 week of it, then, well, by all means, please do the backup on a weekend and only do it once a week. Thank you.